Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Eyes of the Night. Victor Aldridge was the kind of child everyone watched with silent wonder. Adopted as an infant by Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge, he was raised in a modest home on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. From an early age, his mother's influence on him was unquestionable. She was a former schoolteacher with strict principles, her every word a command that set Victor's life into a perfectly calculated course. She guided his first steps, his words, and even his curiosity. And it was his curiosity that both fascinated and unnerved her. Victor's fascination with the natural world began with small things. Insects, frogs, the birds that perched on the fences surrounding their yard. His mother was quick to see his potential for learning and encouraged him. It wasn't long before she introduced him to the intricacies of preservation, an odd interest for a young boy, but Mrs. Aldridge believed that a boy should be educated in all manners of life sciences. She taught him about taxidermy, bought him books on anatomy, and let him handle materials in ways most boys his age wouldn't dream of. Victor's hands quickly grew adept at handling these lifeless creatures, bringing out in him a calm precision that felt, to his mother, like a sign of giftedness. She showed him the art of cleaning, preserving, and stuffing small animals, making their bodies as lifelike as possible. What started with birds that had flown into the windows or frogs found belly up by the roadside quickly evolved into something more deliberate. The initial fascination, innocent enough in Victor's young mind, began to bloom into a dark curiosity about the mechanics of life and death. But it was his 13th birthday that forever changed him. His father, believing it a rite of passage, handed Victor a shotgun. A long, polished piece of steel and wood that gleamed under the Texas sun. The gun was a symbol of manhood in his father's eyes, something that would teach responsibility and control. Yet, for Victor, it became a gateway to something he didn't fully understand. The first day he used the gun was supposed to be a hunting lesson. His father had set up some tin cans in the backyard, and Victor took careful aim, hitting each target with practiced ease. But the cans bored him. He felt an ache, something gnawing within that the metallic clangs couldn't satisfy. It didn't take long before he found his first real target. A bird sat unsuspectingly on the fence one morning, pecking away at a scrap of bread. Without a second thought, Victor raised the gun, took aim, and fired. The body fell to the ground in a twisted, lifeless heap, wings still twitching as if trying to fly one last time. He watched it, a strange thrill vibrating through his hands as he picked it up. The fragility of its neck, the sudden stillness. It was an experience far different from his usual handling of animals already dead. When he took it inside to stuff, his mother barely raised an eyebrow. She simply handed him the tools, watching over his shoulder as he worked with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence. Yet, something about that bird haunted him, a mix of exhilaration and guilt that would creep into his thoughts. In the stillness of night, this ritual of hunting became a dark escape for him, a release from the monotony of school, the constant pressures of his mother's scrutiny, the isolation he felt every day. And as he grew older, Victor's interest only deepened. High school was a challenge, though not for academic reasons. Victor excelled in his studies, especially in subjects like biology and anatomy, where his knowledge seemed nearly encyclopedic. But his classmates sensed something different about him, an eerie, unsettling quality that kept most people at a distance. He had friends, but none who truly understood him or his obsessions. His interest in taxidermy was an oddity, his seriousness a barrier that few dared to cross. He spent more and more time alone, reading in his room or practicing his taxidermy skills, moving on to slightly larger animals, each one an escalation in his pursuit of understanding. His room became a small museum of the macabre, with carefully preserved animals arranged in poses that were almost lifelike. The pride he felt in his work was disturbing even to himself, yet he couldn't stop. He was developing a hunger, something he struggled to name but felt growing inside him. One night, at the age of 16, Victor got into a fight with a classmate. It started over something minor, an accidental shove in the hallway, but it quickly escalated. The other boy threw a punch, and for Victor, the world went red. He hit back with an intensity that shocked even himself. By the time a teacher intervened, the boy was bruised and bleeding. Victor was sent to juvenile detention for a few days, a punishment his parents fought hard to lessen. In the confines of juvenile detention, Victor felt the weight of judgment from all sides, yet he remained calm. He knew he could act his way out of anything, especially with his intelligence and charm. His parents fought for him, convinced this was a phase, something he'd grow out of. But Victor knew otherwise. He was only just beginning. When he received his acceptance letter from North Texas University at 17, Victor saw it as his way out, a chance to start fresh and leave behind the constraints of his hometown. He moved into his dorm, blending into the student population with relative ease. He even attempted to socialize, attending a few parties, joining study groups, and mingling in the crowded dining halls. But it wasn't long before the same detachment set in. His peers couldn't understand him. Their interests were trivial compared to the subjects that fascinated him. Victor's academic pursuits intensified, focusing on anatomy and criminal psychology. Late at night, he would read case studies on violent criminals, psychological profiles, and forensic reports. His mind became a library of grim facts, filling with stories and details that added fuel to his own dark urges. He spent his nights wandering the streets of the city, exploring the shadows and alleys where life seemed grittier, less controlled. Here, he was anonymous, free from expectations and judgment, a spectator in the underbelly of urban life. Each walk stirred something in him, something that pulled him closer to the line he had been dancing around his entire life. On one of those nights, Victor found himself face to face with something he couldn't ignore. A stray dog had wandered into an alley, its ribs visible through its thin, mangy coat. For a moment, Victor felt a pang of pity, but that feeling was quickly eclipsed by a darker urge. The urge was familiar now, a mix of curiosity and a need for control. He cornered the dog, coaxing it closer, feigning kindness. And then, in a swift motion, he ended its life. The rush was almost overwhelming, a powerful sense of domination and knowledge over something that had once been alive. He realized then that animals were no longer enough. This act marked a turning point, one that Victor couldn't return from. He felt a calmness in his mind, a certainty that he had been searching for his whole life. And as he walked away from the scene, he knew he was ready for something more. His thoughts drifted to the people he had seen on his nightly walks, the lives that moved through the city unnoticed. Victor's hunger was only just beginning, and he knew his path would soon take him somewhere far darker than he had ever dared imagine. Years had passed since Victor Aldridge left his small town for the anonymity of city life. Now in his mid-20s, he led an outwardly ordinary life, working a respectable job as an archivist at the city library. His meticulous nature and vast knowledge made him a favorite among his colleagues, who saw him as a quiet, well-read man dedicated to his work. They had no idea what darkness lay beneath the surface. For Victor, the library offered him solitude and control, a place where he could observe people without being seen. He found comfort in the silence of the stacks, where he spent hours combing through historical records and reading case files of unsolved murders. His fascination with true crime went unnoticed, and the library offered a discreet means to feed his hunger for knowledge about society's hidden side. Yet Victor's urges never left him. No matter how he tried to blend in, to adopt the habits of a normal man, there was always a pull, an insistent, throbbing desire he could not ignore. It was this urge that led him into the night, wandering the streets under the cover of darkness, searching for something he could never quite define. Victor's nightly walks became a ritual. Dressed in plain clothes, he walked through the dimly lit streets of the downtown district, his eyes scanning the alleys and shadowy corners. He told himself it was to satisfy his curiosity, but deep down, he knew he was waiting for an opportunity, something or someone, to satisfy the darker urges that had plagued him since he was a child. One particular night, Victor's steps took him to a poorly lit alley near a bustling nightclub. He spotted her almost immediately. A young woman, blonde, stumbling as she tried to find her way out of the maze of alleyways. She was alone, vulnerable, and Victor's pulse quickened. He kept his distance at first, observing her, waiting for the opportune moment. When she finally turned down an alley that led to a dead end, he followed. His footsteps were soft, calculated, and before she realized he was there, he was close enough to reach out and touch her. The thrill was overpowering, his heart racing as he approached. The woman looked back, startled, and their eyes met. She stumbled backward, fear overtaking her as she realized there was no escape. In a moment of impulse, Victor lunged, his hands moving instinctively. The act was swift, calculated, and by the time he stepped back, he felt a rush he had never known before. A dark satisfaction mixed with the dread of what he had done. He left her there, careful to remove any evidence of his presence, and disappeared into the night, his heart still pounding as he made his way back home. The days following the incident were a blur. Victor kept a low profile, watching the news obsessively for any mention of the woman's body. His mind raced with thoughts of what he had done, the thrill of it mingling with an underlying fear. But as he watched the city's reaction, he felt a strange calm. He was smarter than them, he told himself. He had been careful, meticulous. When the report finally came, it was vague. A body found in an alleyway, no immediate leads, no witnesses. The police suspected foul play, but there was no evidence, nothing to suggest a motive or a suspect. Victor felt a surge of satisfaction. He had outsmarted them, and the realization emboldened him. He had no intention of stopping. He was too careful, too intelligent to be caught. Yet, as the nights passed, his mind drifted back to that moment, the thrill of power, the control he had over life and death. He returned to his walks, careful to vary his routes, blending in with the night as he searched for his next encounter. It wasn't long before the city became aware of him. The papers began reporting on a series of unsolved deaths. All young women, all found in various parts of the city, and each time, the details were chillingly similar. The bodies were discovered unclothed, with signs of violence, but no clues that led to any concrete suspect. Victor felt a dark satisfaction as he read the articles. The city's fear grew with each passing day, rumors spreading about a killer who prowled the streets at night, choosing his victims at random. They called him the Midnight Hunter, a name that both thrilled and terrified Victor. It was his secret identity, a shadow he could slip into whenever he felt the need to release his pent-up desires. But the thrill was beginning to consume him. Each night, he pushed further, seeking out the edges of his control, testing the limits of his own cunning. He began to take risks, lingering longer in places he shouldn't be, drawn to the thrill of nearly being discovered. His need for control warred with his desire for the rush, and he knew that sooner or later, he would have to find a way to satisfy both. One night, Victor's routine took a dangerous turn. He was following another young woman through the narrow streets, his footsteps, silent as he shadowed her every move. But this time he was careless. A police patrol car turned the corner, its headlights illuminating the alley where he stood, casting his shadow against the wall. For a brief moment he froze, the panic rising as he realized how close he was to being caught. The patrol car slowed, the officers eyeing him suspiciously, but Victor kept his composure. He forced a casual smile, waving them off as if he were just a passerby. The officers watched him for a moment longer before driving away, but the encounter left him shaken. He could feel his control slipping, his once cold demeanor fraying at the edges. But the brush with law enforcement only made him more determined. The thrill of nearly being caught had intensified his urges, making him crave the hunt even more. He knew he couldn't continue this way forever, but the midnight hunter within him was growing stronger, pushing him toward the brink of recklessness. The media frenzy around the midnight hunter escalated as more bodies were found. The city's fear was palpable. People avoided the streets at night, warnings circulated among social circles, and the police increased their patrols. But none of it was enough to stop Victor. He was careful, calculated, slipping through the cracks of their investigation with a chilling ease. Yet, there was a part of him that wanted to be noticed, to leave a mark that would make the city remember him long after he was gone. He began to leave subtle clues, small details that would taunt the police without incriminating him directly. A torn piece of cloth, a scrap of paper with cryptic words, each one a breadcrumb for the authorities to follow. And follow they did. Detectives began piecing together a profile, speculating on the kind of person who could commit such acts with such precision. The Midnight Hunter was becoming an enigma, a ghost that haunted their every lead, but each clue only led them to dead ends. Victor reveled in their confusion, feeding off their frustration as he continued his nocturnal hunts. He had become a master of evasion, a shadow in the city's periphery, moving unseen, unstoppable. Despite his careful planning, Victor's obsession began to take its toll. He found himself slipping, making mistakes that could easily expose him. His once rigid routines grew chaotic, his need for control colliding with his desire for chaos. The Midnight Hunter was consuming him, drawing him into a darkness he could no longer escape. One night, Victor found himself at the edge of the city, staring into the empty streets as he wrestled with the conflict within. He knew he couldn't continue this way, yet the idea of stopping felt impossible. His life had become a series of encounters, each one pushing him closer to the edge of discovery. But as he looked out over the city he had come to dominate, Victor felt a surge of power. He was untouchable, a figure of fear and legend, a shadow that moved beyond the reach of law and order. The Midnight Hunter was his identity now, and he would wear it until the end, no matter the cost. Detective Mark Tatum sat in his cluttered office, staring at the growing pile of files on his desk. He'd been tracking the Midnight Hunter for months, yet he felt no closer to catching him. The man was a ghost, slipping in and out of the city's shadows with ease, leaving no trace but fear. It was as though he knew every step the police would take before they even took it. The city was in turmoil. Citizens walked with heads down, glancing over their shoulders, quickening their steps after dark. Public outcry grew as the body count rose, and the mayor increased the pressure on law enforcement to catch the elusive killer. Tatum was frustrated but determined. The Midnight Hunter was cunning, but he'd made one critical mistake. He left patterns, subtle enough that most would miss them, but Tatum noticed. Each victim had something in common. They lived near an old library, one frequented by a quiet, unassuming archivist named Victor Aldridge. Tatum's instincts told him that Victor knew something. The detective requested surveillance on Victor, hoping for the slightest lead. Victor could feel the walls closing in. Days that were once filled with silent satisfaction were now marred by paranoia. He noticed people watching him, the new librarian's furtive glances, a stranger in a car parked too long across the street. He saw shadows everywhere, and they whispered his name, accusing him, taunting him. The thrill of the hunt was fading, replaced by a nagging dread. His once precise habits were slipping. On one of his nighttime outings, he misjudged his timing, nearly walking into the path of a police cruiser. He retreated quickly but left a trace, a footprint, faint but visible in the mud. It was a small mistake, but to Victor it felt monumental. He tried to brush it off, to cling to the power he once felt, but his composure was crumbling. Victor's mental state spiraled as he tried to maintain his facade. He spent sleepless nights at the library, hiding behind stacks of books, poring over records of other killers, as though he could gain insight into his own dark urges. But no amount of reading could quiet the fear that he was losing control. Detective Tatum's surveillance bore fruit one rainy night when Victor slipped up. He watched as Victor paced nervously, his hands shaking as he pulled his coat tighter around him, darting down an alley with a suspicious glance over his shoulder. Tatum's suspicions grew. This was no ordinary man. He began digging into Victor's past, finding records of his childhood and noticing a disturbing pattern. Victor had always been close to violence. A breakthrough came when Tatum uncovered an old newspaper article from Victor's hometown. A young boy had been involved in the death of a family pet under strange circumstances, and shortly after, his father had vanished, rumored to have left without a trace. Tatum saw a pattern of dark secrets and trauma, the perfect ingredients for a fractured mind. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that he was closing in on Victor. He stayed late at the office, sifting through Victor's life, searching for anything that could be used against him. Tatum was relentless, driven by a mixture of disgust and fascination with the man he believed was responsible for the city's terror. Victor sensed he was running out of time. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts, his once calm demeanor replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. As Tatum's investigation closed in, Victor grew erratic, his usual carelessness slipping into desperation. He thought about fleeing, but something held him back. The idea of losing control, of being forced out of the city he had come to dominate. One night, Victor noticed Detective Tatum outside his apartment, pacing the street like a predator circling his prey. His heart pounded as he realized the gravity of his situation. This was no coincidence. He was being hunted, and it would only be a matter of time before Tatum came for him. In a last-ditch effort, Victor decided to confront the detective himself. He invited Tatum to his apartment under the guise of cooperating with the investigation, masking his fear with a feigned innocence. Tatum accepted, wary but intrigued. The tension was palpable as the two men faced each other, Victor's calm veneer clashing with the intensity of Tatum's gaze. Their conversation was laced with suspicion, each man sizing up the other, searching for weaknesses. But Victor's composure slipped as Tatum began to mention the victims, probing him with questions that hit too close to home. Desperation took hold, and in a moment of madness, Victor lunged at Tatum, his hand reaching for a knife he'd hidden nearby. Tatum was prepared, dodging the attack and subduing Victor in a struggle that left them both breathless. The detective managed to handcuff Victor, and the facade shattered. Victor broke down, the calm, quiet man replaced by a creature of rage and despair. He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the dimly lit apartment, as he realized he had lost his game. The arrest sent shockwaves through the city. News of the Midnight Hunter's capture spread quickly, and Victor's face became the symbol of the city's darkest nightmare. People were horrified to learn that the quiet, polite archivist they trusted was responsible for so many deaths. The media painted Victor as a monster, dissecting every detail of his life, every hint of his twisted nature. During the interrogation, Victor revealed pieces of his past, but his answers were fragmented, alternating between cold detachment and uncontrollable rage. He spoke of his childhood, of the anger he'd harbored for years, of the thrill he felt as he claimed his first victim. The detectives were both horrified and fascinated, realizing that Victor was a product of years of hidden pain and isolation. Detective Tatum listened to Victor's confessions, piecing together the story of a man who had descended into darkness one calculated step at a time. There was no dramatic twist, no fantastical motive, only a deeply broken man who had let his desires consume him. In the end, the Midnight Hunter was no more than a shadow, a figure born from Victor's fractured mind. With Victor's capture, the city began to breathe again. People returned to the streets, no longer casting wary glances into dark alleys, no longer haunted by the midnight hunter's presence. The memory of the fear he'd instilled lingered, but life slowly returned to normal. Detective Tatum, however, couldn't shake the weight of the case. He spent long hours reviewing his notes, haunted by the fact that Victor had lived undetected for so long. The Midnight Hunter had been a man like any other, a quiet figure in the background, invisible until he chose to reveal himself. Tatum knew that there were others like him, hidden in the city's shadows, waiting to emerge. The case left a scar on Tatum, a reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of everyday life. He returned to his work, determined to ensure that no other predator would slip through his grasp. The Midnight Hunter's legacy was a lesson, a chilling reminder of the evil that could exist in the most ordinary places. Victor's final days were spent in isolation, his mind unraveling further as he replayed the events that led to his capture. He was no longer the Midnight Hunter. That identity had been stripped from him, leaving only Victor Aldridge, a man alone with his demons. He'd become a curiosity to the world, a tragic figure whose life had been a descent into darkness. In his final moments, Victor's mind drifted back to his first victim, the thrill he'd felt, the power he'd held. It was a memory he clung to, even as the world forgot him, a fleeting shadow in the city's history. And as he faded into obscurity, the Midnight Hunter became a myth, a tale whispered among those who remembered, a reminder that darkness could reside in the most unexpected of places.